What I remember, what I want to bring back from my memory is that one of the first articles on cinema in the film studies vein, as we call it today, was actually Venkateshwaran that I read in 95, 96, which was published in the journal Samvadam, if I remember, edited by Sanjeev. What I did not know at the time, I mean, at the time we were, as Venkati was saying, as students reading the writings of the new left critics of sorts, like T.K. Ramachandran to all the way to A. Soman. Though at the time we clubbed all of them together, I think it's time to reevaluate their work and look at the differences between them and so on and so forth. There was also journals like Deep Focus and so on and so forth that were coming out at the time, which had already started discussions of cinema in relation to the Hindu right, the mobilization from the Hindu right, and also the critique of patriarchy at the time. What I did not know at the time when I read Venkati's work was that there's a historical kind of coincidence between that piece that I read and a whole lot of developments that was happening elsewhere in relation to film studies as a discipline. I mean, 95 is the year when a significant conference happens on Indian cinema, which is the Making Meaning Indian Cinema conference in Shimla. And the next important essay that I read, which is by Murli, who's here, Timur Lidharan, was actually a paper that was presented in that conference, but did not, for reasons, complicated reasons, did not make it to the volume. So in some sense, there was a historical moment in the mid-90s, which already had seen the establishment of film studies in Jadavpur University as a separate discipline, and so on and so forth. 96, 97, when there were language cinema conferences, which was the Tamil and Telugu cinema conferences. So there was a historical moment there, which I was not at the time, I mean, I only realized later. What is interesting for me is that something that Venkati mentioned, that the attention to the popular seemed to be actually something that was necessitated also by that turn in film studies in relation to this formation called cultural studies, which I'll come to in a minute, which necessitated an attention on ideas of the state, on secularism, on patriarchy, and so on and so forth, which were very central to the political concerns of the time in 90s India. And that necessitated an attention to the popular, because this was an attempt also to think cinema as a social engagement, right? So that was very central in the turn to the popular in the 90s as a way of socializing cinema, if you will, right? Away from thinking about it as esoteric practice. Now, all this needs to be complicated. I'm not saying art cinema is esoteric practice necessarily, but that is how it was imagined at the time. What I will do quickly in the next few minutes is to stay well within what Venkati's put on the table and offer some thoughts on what he's actually said. One of the major issues that Venkati's flagged is the relationship between, one of the things that Venkati's actually talked about is the figure of the film critic or the film scholar, right? And the questions that arise in relation to the practice of the film scholar, film critic, and the location of the film scholar, film critic. I mean, this is one central problematic that Venkati's actually put on the table. Now, here I want to actually suggest that there seems to be a history to this engagement, which we need to actually take into account, where if you actually look at early Malayalam film criticism from the 1950s, you actually look at the first generation of film critics, you will see that there is a clear imagination of a domain of writing which is separate from the film industry at that time. Now, this is also an attempt to keep away from film journalism, which is seen as a lower kind of a form at the time, and to function within a certain elite literary sphere in the pages of, say, Kaumudi or Madhubhumi Weekly and things like that. So that separation is very central. Now, this has created interesting kind of debates and fights within the film industry. In 1962, for example, Cynic is sued by Udaya Studio for a review. And what Madhubhumi does is to actually settle the case by suggesting that Cynic or Madhubhumi will not review Udaya's films after that. So if you look at the 2-volume book of Cynics that is published, that's out at the time, you will see that from 1962, none of the Udaya films are reviewed, are published in the thing. So there is that separation of domains, which was very central to that practice, which also, like I said, wanted to devalue film journalism. That was very important. Film journalism was seen as very much part of the film industry. very much within kind of wanting to actually create public relations for the industry and so on. Now, this is important because the first film magazine in Malayalam, which is KV Koshi's Cinema, actually states its intentions very much in relation to how the magazine Cinema will support the film industry. I mean, that is exactly the way Koshi actually begins the publication of Cinema, and Koshi himself was a distributor and later a producer after that. So that's the first stage. The second stage is precisely what Venkati talked about, which is the moment of the film society, where again, it's interesting that if you think about it, the film society, film practice, both from filmmaking, film watching to writing, I mean, writing was very central, maybe even more central than filmmaking and film watching during that time. So film society engagement with cinema is very much a literary practice, a writing practice about cinema. And you will also notice that most of the critics of the time, except exceptions like T.K. Ramendra and so on, were also aspiring filmmakers or wanted to make a film. Or, I mean, you take it in the Ravi, you take it Babu Bharadwaj, you take all these people, they were all okay, Johnny. You take all these people, they were also making films at the time. Or wanted to make films at the time. This all the way across up to Vijayakrishnan and V. Radhakrishnan. I mean, you take all these people, you will see that they had a kind of a feat, like one feat in the filmmaking aspiration, other feat in the writing world. And that changes with the film studies movement in the 90s, where I think what actually happens is that engagement with cinema of this kind, precisely because of its investment in issues that I mentioned earlier, which is about state secularism, patriarchy, and so on, dissociates itself from the film industry, right? And creates a certain space of autonomy for itself and relocates it at the domain of pedagogy. And this is very important. I think that the pedagogical shift is what actually happens. Now, when there is discussion about academic film writing and so on and so forth, the pedagogic aspect of such writings is never taken into account. That these are mostly written for teaching and for syllabi making and so on and so forth also, right? So that space of autonomy is what the film scholarship of the 90s actually creates. Now, I don't want at this point of time to create a hierarchy or a value judgment about these practices, but I think what we need to do is to actually understand the different valences and different kind of roles that these kind of writings played in relation to cinema, in relation to publics, and so on and so forth, when we kind of do this history of film writing in the world. I mean, rather than think of one as better than the other, these is different purposes, different kind of structures, and so on and so forth. You will realize that none of them replaces earlier forms. It goes into a different domain. I mean, it's not like one comes in, the other disappears. Film society writing did not displace film criticism. The film studies did not displace the other two. I mean, hierarchies are created, of course, but that's also part of the way education expands at a particular time, new people coming into a classroom, whole set of imaginations that happens at the time. So this is one aspect I think we could take into account to understand the location of the film critic. This takes me to a second aspect of the vernacular, the film critic question, which is the question of the vernacular that Venkati actually presented to us. I think that's an important and a very, very interesting kind of a problematic to take into account and needs a considerable amount of thought and work to actually get at the kind of grainier differences between these practices and how they play out around us. One of the things that's important to think is that, I mean, again, this might sound like an apology for the academic film criticism, but it's not. That in fact, the notion of a public for film writing exists only in the vernacular. Now, this is an important kind of an issue to be taken into account. Whereas academic film writing do not function, like I said earlier, its impetus is towards pedagogy, and the classroom is its public rather than, and peers in classrooms. I mean, that's its public rather than it being. So pedagogy is the way in which it actually percolates and moves around in film criticism, whereas the vernacular writing actually functions with an imagination of the public. Now, again, like I said, rather than create a hierarchy here, we need to actually think with the differences between these practices and this question about its mode of address and so on. Now, the critic scholar in the vernacular participates in a historically mutating linguistic public. I mean, that's a very important issue. That the reading public is very much part of a literary culture, which is very much connected to language practices. And in some sense, it's also linked in a place like India to governmental practices of state formation and linguistic states and so on and so forth, creating and sustaining linguistic publics in our historical time. And that's an important element in our understanding of the film critics location. Now, I am, in my own work, have been kind of trying to work outside the global and the local as a kind of framework, or the vernacular and the cosmopolitan, but to actually think with categories that come from the kind of writings of Heidegger and Hannah Arendt and so on and so forth, which actually is captured by a literary scholar called Feng Xia, who recently argued his work is called World Against Globe, right? I mean, he makes an argument for thinking about world as a category coming from Heidegger and Arendt, and the significance of storytelling and image making that comes from Arendt directly in thinking about how our existence is worlded in particular ways. In many ways, there is an imagination of a universal in all particulars. In many ways, the desire to escape the limits of the particular is very much central to the claiming of the particular itself. Now, this is very clear in the Malayali fascination with world cinema, right? That the particular is very much linked to the accessing of the world in a certain manner. Without that world, the local, the particular, does not even kind of exist. And there are interesting things that happen in this narrative. I mean, something that I've tried to kind of discuss in something that I've written before, which is curious situations like what happened in 1998 at IFFK, which I've written about, where there's a debate between Christoph Sanusi and P. Govindapilla, and at a point of time, Govindapilla turns the tables and actually starts teaching Sanusi world history, and kind of finally locates Sanusi in a Christian particularity beyond which he cannot actually think, right? So this kind of turning of the tables, on the one hand, needs an imagination of the world, which can actually create notions of the universe and the particular, but also needs a public. And that public is a vernacular public for P. Govindapilla, who is the audience of the film forum, the discussion forum in IFFK. So in many ways, this place of the vernacular, of the vernacular, what we call the vernacular and the cosmopolitan, would be rethought in terms of the particular and the universal in relation to these notions of the worlding, not as oppositions, particular and universal, not as oppositions, but as potentialities within each other in a certain kind of manner. I mean, at the end of the day, we know that all texts, all articulations are particular, and under historical conditions, it gains a certain universal quality. I mean, there is no other way. There's no by default universal object in the world, or by default particular text in the world. Everything functions within that historical kind of a frame. Here, I actually want to bring in the concept of translation, which is, I think, something that we could think with in thinking about this location, which I mean, Tejaswini Niranjana's essay on translation and feminism from 1998, I think is very interesting here to actually track the condition of the post, what she calls the third world critique. We can reformulate the third world into other kind of hierarchical formulations that we want to kind of think about. And she talks about how our critical practice is necessarily always what she calls in translation, right? So in some sense, translating between, and for her, translating is both a linguistic and a conceptual question. And I think in Venkati, these two were there, the linguistic and the conceptual. The translating between these, irrespective of what language you're writing in, is a necessary condition for Niranjana, for the third world critique. And a couple of things that she says. She says translation for her is a space in which, I'm quoting her, one simultaneously holds on to and negotiates different sort of languages, conceptual as well as linguistic. She also says the importance of moving in and out of languages, of being always between languages. And these are important kind of ways in which for her, the third world scholar actually functions. One could imagine a spectrum of habitation within these demands of translation, right? Depending on locations, languages used, publics formed, one could actually think of the demands being kind of multiple and on a kind of spectrum. I was also curious to think that Venkati's title had in and out, right, in the title. So in some sense, Venkati positions himself knowingly or unknowingly in the title as somebody between the in and out. I mean, otherwise you cannot see the in and out, right? I mean, if you actually position that way. And I think that's precisely the space of translation that we're actually talking about, a place from where the in and the out can be imagined. So in some ways, in the spectrum of translation, the in and out, the global and the local, the universal particular, the cosmopolitan vernacular are what we create in that space of translation as the inside and outside of our practice, right? So in some sense, what Venkati is doing, I would argue, is not a description, but an institution of a separation between the in and out of the global and the local, which is a provocation that Venkati is actually bringing to the table for people like us to actually respond to. It's not a mere description. It is a provocation. It's an argument that he's bringing to the table, and he's instituting this in and out in this kind of argument. Now, like again, if you look at Venkati's presentation, we will see that in his own retelling of the story, it's always been a kind of a global phenomena, right? I mean, he's always engaged with the globe. I mean, if you look at all these early writings, you will see the neo-Marxists, it's fully Althusserian in its kind of imagination, Ravindran and all these people. And if you actually look at one of the first important critical pieces in this tradition, but not Marxist, that came out before the publication of Kala Vimarsham Marxist Siddhantam, was actually Nisar Ahmad's article, which came as an introduction to the collection of 4 scripts. The book was titled Yatharthathinte Nalu Mukhangal and published by the same publishers of Kala Vimarsham Marxist Manadandam. In that, he actually uses Sassurian linguistics and Christian myths, and this is 1981. So in some sense, this theoretical formulation of the apparatus actually enters film writing much before what we today understand as film studies, right? But that is the tradition that it actually follows. The shift that we see, and for me, Venkati is very important in that shift in the 90s, looking from Calicut at the time when one did not have access to these scholars, one had to kind of find this one bookshop where you might get the copy of Deep Focus and actually go there and check. And that's how one stumbled upon Samvadam and read Venkati's piece because of this one bookshop had them. Venkati was very central for me in that kind of shift in the 90s that we actually see. Like I said, Murali's work and Sanjeev's work, Sanjeev's work were the other work that actually, Sanjeev's work appeared in Kerala Padanangal. And these were very important turning points for me. Couple of small things regarding this. In this context, as I speak next less than 10 minutes, I'll end. There are few questions that Venkati, if interested, could respond to. That one, for example, is there's a vernacular critique while is kind of a formulation that is founded on language differentiation, so to speak, which is both conceptual and linguistic. What would be vernacular theorization as opposed to cosmopolitan theorization? Because at some point he mentioned vernacular theorization, if language is not the only difference here. What I have in mind is, if you actually think about one of the iconic essays in Indian film studies, which is Ashish Rajadeksha's Falke Era, which came out in 1993, he starts his discussion of perception with a description of D.D. Kosambi's book, where D.D. Kosambi takes the reader on a walk in his house and describes the objects that are laid out in the house that he owns. And it is from there that actually this theorization actually happens. So is language central to this problem of vernacular theorization, or are we actually thinking about some other formulation could be something we can actually think about? Now, I don't want to for a second discount that there are academic hierarchies, there are language hierarchies in terms of publication and so on and so forth, which is a different layer to this problem that exists, and where, for example, different people are located in terms of access and so on differently across the spectrum of critical thinking again. One also wants to think with the last part of Venkati's discussion, where he talked about some of the limitations, some of the things that the Malayalam film writing does not take into account and so on. Is somewhere this islandness also some kind of a fait accompli one can actually think about? This islandness is something that is also taken as its ration, so to speak, right? Like because this non-attention to archive, because it's not because the archive is not there, we have not looked at the right people, and we've not actually not given value to these archivists in the first place, right? So in some sense, there is an attention to the intellectual, the rational, the non-sensorial that Venkati talked about, which actually discounts the cinephilic. And cinephilic is the cinephile is the archivist. If there's an archivist around us, it is the cinephile. And so in some sense, Venkati's the diagnosis that Venkati provided, which is the anti-pleasure, which is also anti-cinephilia, I would imagine, is also partly part of the problem when we think about the archiving kind of question. So that's another thing that one can think about. Is there a comfort space that what Venkati is calling the vernacular? Now, individually, what Venkati might be unhappy with inhabiting that space and so on and so forth, but as a domain, is there something that actually exists within a certain comfort, which is provided by the public that I actually started with in a certain fashion? So if there's an echo chamber in one place, there's an echo chamber in another place, kind of situation, creating multiple echo chambers in various kind of locations. Okay, and I was also thinking that this discussion about global attention to articulations. Now, I'm also wondering in the context of this extensive and unwarranted attention on Malayalam cinema nationally at this point of time, whether such attention is itself good or not is something that I'm actually currently wondering, but I don't have an answer. I wouldn't say it is not, or it is or something, but it's troubling to see the kind of celebration, the kind of uncritical celebration that's going on of Malayalam cinema in the last 2 years in India. So that's again something that is some to kind of consider. Couple of small points, and I will end with this. One is about cultural studies, which I will not go into because I've already mentioned some of the differences. And in many ways, the new left tradition, which actually defines cultural studies in the West, in the US and the American context, was not the moment of cultural studies in India. And that is the distinction we might want to make. Like I said, the new left imagination actually was picked up by the generation before, which is the 70s, 80s generation of critics. And it's actually an engagement, which I think is very historically specific, with history and state. These are the two formations around which the 90s cultural studies actually functioned. So if you actually turn the lens in that direction, will we get a different story is something that we could think about. So in terms of Venkati's thing about repeating concepts and the kind of constant reinvocation of the same things, I remember when Laura Mulvey visited Bangalore around early 2000s, she started her talk by saying that she's still shocked that visual pleasure narrative cinema is used by people, because for her, and this is important in our discussion, for her, it was a polemic well within a very small group of British films theorists, which was very much a 70s debate, which she did not anticipate a life for that article. So here again, one can think about the particularity that Laura Mulvey imagined for her text, right? Which was not imagined to have a universal, a global life in a certain manner, but then it takes on for various reasons. And that is nothing that Laura Mulvey can control or needs to control, right? It is because of feminism, feminist film criticism. It is about a sudden kind of opening to look at patriarchy in cinema that all this happens and so on. But I think, like Venkati, it's time we need to kind of look at those concepts and see whether they are useful. Two last points, and both of them are questions to Venkati. One of them is, Venkati, it's quite interesting how, and this is not just you, okay? Even if I did the same thing, I think I will do the same. And so it's not just you, all of us would do this, that when we talk about our past in terms of our kind of growth as a scholar, as a film critic, and so on and so forth, cinema features marginal to that story. And this is interesting because in some sense, our pleasures, we want to take back our pleasures. We want to kind of look at the sensorium. And like I said, Venkati, if I did this, I might do the same thing. I might end up telling you what all books I read and what all writers I was reading and so on and so forth. Film might appear, but in a very marginal way. So is there a way to redescribe ourselves as formed through cinema and not through writing and literature? And I think this is part of the problem of our engagement with cinema, that we are not able to go beyond the writing practices of cinema as constituting our engagement with cinema. Though I'm sure in a private conversation, I'm sure we might be able to say a lot of things, but how do we intellectually factor that into our own descriptions? That's one thing I would like Venkati to respond if possible. Like I said, but it's not a question about Venkati, it's a question about all of us, right? And the last one I want to ask is, Venkati, it's clear that you're one of the few people who actually has been pushing this argument about not looking at text in an integrationist manner, not privileging closures, thinking about single meanings of the text and so on and so forth. But in some sense, in your work on the early days of Malayalam cinema in the 1950s, if I make a suggestion that somewhere this kind of integrationist approach does appear in the face of the national regional public that is formed in your work on Neelakuil and Rajasthan Pavarn and so on and so forth, how would you actually respond to it? Is there a different way to actually look at those texts that you have extensively worked on? Because in your work on contemporary stuff, I can see that you work with an image economy which is multiple. You write on television, on internet, on cinema, and so on and so forth, and their interrelationships. But how do we actually make this possible in the 1950s in relation to your own work? Now, these are some of the things that I wanted to put on the table. I hope it will generate some conversation. Thank you.